Good evening. I'm John Worthen, president of Ball State University, and I'm pleased to welcome you to UniverCity 92. We've had a wonderful week on the Ball State campus, and I want to especially thank Bruce Meyer and Paul Lassalle, both professors of the College of Architecture and Planning, and Professor Beth Vanderwilt in our theater department, professor in our theater department. These people have organized and planned UniverCity 92 and have done an excellent job. Business and minoring in Japanese. She grew up on a farm outside of Warren, Indiana, where she was active in 4-H of Student Association. Christy's goal is to improve the campus community relationships. Already SA officers are taking an active role in the village activities address the issues of UniverCity 92, being good neighbors both at home and abroad. I'm pleased
and welcoming Mr. Terry Waite.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much indeed for the warmth of your welcome, which I have experienced this afternoon when I arrived here, and also directly experienced from you this evening. It's a particular pleasure for me to have the opportunity to be with you tonight. I thought when you invited me to speak in this great new building, you might be inviting me to demonstrate my skills at basketball. But it is good to see you. First of all, before I go into my main address, may I also thank you for your care and support over the past years. I've met many people today who have said how they remembered not only, of course, myself, but remembered my companions who were detained for the 5 years. And if I may speak on their behalf, your support and care and continued concern, it means a great deal to us. And I'm also very happy to be here in this university setting and bring you greetings from my own university, where I am at Trinity Hall in Cambridge, England. And I bring you greetings from that university, which is just a little older than this campus. My own college, Trinity Hall, was founded in 1350. And when I saw my rooms, I didn't think they'd been decorated since 1350. One of the remarkable phenomena following my release and the release of my fellows was the fact that I received an enormous amount of mail from right across the world. So much so that at Lambeth Palace in London, which is the home of the Archbishop of Canterbury and his principal office, 4 secretaries were employed full-time simply opening the mail and responding to it. There are something like 60 to 80,000 letters which I have yet to look at, and that will take some considerable time to get through. The mail has dropped off now somewhat to around about 100 letters a week, which makes it a little more manageable. But the reason for mentioning that is because I begin my narrative account today by telling you about a letter I received. My home in London is right by Greenwich Park, near the River Thames. And each year, the London Marathon starts in Greenwich Park. And this year, because it starts just behind my house, the organisers invited me to start the marathon, simply to drop the flag. So on the morning of the race, I went on my way. A week later, a letter, and she said, as you were walking across the heath to go to the start of the marathon, you spoke of my child. Oh, look! There's a famous man. He was a hostage for 5 years. UK. Some of the letters have been less than amusing. I'm reminded of another letter Bill moment to give you a more detailed account of that experience. Speaking, again, I should talk about that in a moment. And of course, it was an extended stay which lasted not a surprise. They had been taken by a colleague of mine, or a friend of mine I should say, who was in the press corps. He'd taken them and delivered them to the British Embassy. The situation is almost certain that that lady will never see her husband again. Almost certainly he died in captivity in the Middle East, not just Europeans, but Lebanese and others will have to live claimed great international expertise or great political expertise. It was humanitarian considerations to bear upon problems which seemed to defeat, and understandably defeat, so many people. The first involvement with hostages for myself goes back many years into Africa. My days when I lived in Uganda and with my family went through the revolutionary times when General Amin came to power. But the principal involvement, and the first significant one, which I will outline for you to begin with, was when I was at Lambeth Palace, and we were approached by the families of people who had been taken hostage in Iran. At that time, in the early 1980s, Iran was passing through revolutionary times, as is well known and well documented. The Shah had been deposed, Ayatollah Khomeini was in power, and there was a considerable amount of turmoil in the country. Not surprisingly, in all revolutionary situations of that kind, small groups of foreigners and small groups of those who differ in ideology or religion from the mainstream ideology and religion of the country become targets and a focus for suspicion. That suspicion at that time centered on the small but dedicated Anglican Church in Iran. And there are very simple reasons for that. At the time of revolution, it's almost as though some members of the community develop a form of paranoia that makes people extraordinarily suspicious of anyone who doesn't fit in with the main line. The Anglican Church became a target of suspicion because it had been noted that from time to time people from the British Embassy had gone into that building. Now you can say that is suspicious. On the other hand, it is quite natural and normal that people from England who would belong to the Church of England would go to worship in their own building. It depends how you look at the situation. Because members of the British Embassy had been seen going in the building, certain radicals therefore assumed that this was, in fact, a nest of spies. And 3 English church workers were taken hostage, and 4 Iranians, 2 Iranian clergymen and 2 lay people. We received early notification of this in London, and for a while we kept very quiet, hoping that they would be discovered and that their release would be gained through the normal diplomatic channels without any further intervention. The months went by and no news was received. Eventually, the families came to us and said, "Please, can you help?" And of course, we couldn't refuse that request. The first problem, of course, in a situation of this kind is to gain access to the country, and so I applied myself to the Iranian embassy in London. When I came back, the visa had arrived, and the following morning, Christmas morning, I was on an Iranian civil airliner bound for Tehran. The first problem, as I said, is to get access to the situation. And the second problem, which is one which presents an independent person such as myself with considerable difficulty, in fact would present anyone with considerable difficulty, is to how to make contact with those who are holding the hostages. And there are no set guidelines. It is difficult and dangerous, and risks have to be taken. Always, governments would be obliged and are obliged to warn people such as myself not to step foot in that situation because they have to say it is too dangerous. And they are right, it is dangerous. And one has to make a calculation and say, if one is going to be involved in the negotiations, then you make a full and fair assessment of the situation insofar as you can and make a recognition of the dangers that are present. On arrival in Iran, this was the first problem that faced me, how to make contact. The small church community had not met for a long period of time. Their clergy had been taken and they had been scattered. And so I decided that I would call them together for a Christmas service. I got on the telephone, I had the numbers of certain church leaders, and I asked them to pass the message around. On the evening of the service, I went to the small church building, wondering if anyone would turn up. And sure enough, the door of the church opened and people began to come in until the church was really quite full. I am not a clergyman, I am a layman. But I took a service as best I could and climbed into the pulpit to give a Christmas address, the first service that these people had had for a long, long time. I wanted them to be encouraged and supported. After about 5 minutes, the side door of the church opened again, and into the room came 6 or 8 Revolutionary Guards, dressed in their full uniform and carrying automatic weapons, which they brought with them into the building. In Anglican churches, the front pew is normally empty, and so the guards came and they sat in the front pew. They clattered their automatics down before them and sat with their arms folded, looking at me. My only response to that was, well, I said, I'm pleased to welcome you. You're rather late for the service and you've missed the first 5 minutes. I shall begin again. And so I began my address again. I couldn't think of anything else to say. At the end of that address and at the end of the service, I went down and shook them by the hand. And to my surprise, a man who identified himself as their leader said, "We like what you say. We will take you to see your people." Well, now, that sounds very simplistic. But, in fact, that presents and raises yet another issue. Whom in those situations do you trust? Who is genuine? The people who came into the church building could have been anyone. They could have been out to kidnap me and to take me. Is it reasonable to take a risk and to go with them in the night across Tehran with the hope that truth is being told and that this might be the first step in a long process of negotiation? Or should one say no and back away? In that situation, there are a few guidelines, and one can only go on what I would say is a reasonably developed intuition, an intuition which might be able to tell you that truth is being spoken. Intuition is a useful ability, but it's not infallible. It's good when it works, and when it doesn't, it can be disastrous. I decided, on the basis of intuition, that it was in fact an opportunity worth following. And so I said, yes, I will come with you. We set out and got into the car and drove across the city. We drove for about half an hour and then came to a large camp which was being used as an interrogation camp. There were people there of all nationalities. I went into the camp and then was introduced for the first time, to my great relief, to John and Audrey Coleman, the British couple. John was a doctor and a clergyman, His wife was with him, and they'd both been kept there for weeks and weeks without change of clothing, simply with a mattress on the floor in this building. Later, they took me to meet Jean Waddell, another Scottish lady who'd been a secretary in the church, who'd opened her door one night and was shot, half strangled, and left for dead. When she made some form of recovery, she was taken and thrown into the Avine prison. And I was able to gain access to the Avine prison and meet with Jean. And eventually I was taken to see the 4 Iranians. After a long process of discussion and negotiation through the guards who were in relationship with the Ayatollah, it was possible to convince them that these were innocent people and that they should be released. I formed a personal and somewhat friendly relationship with the leader of the Revolutionary Guard. He took me to his home, and he produced a large photograph album. He turned the pages over, and he said, "These are my brothers." There were 6 or 7 photographs. This one is dead. This one is dead. All of them have had to discontinue their education. He was a man, and as a family, they had suffered greatly. In the previous regime, their family had suffered appalling persecution. Which leads me to the point that hostage-taking and terrorism of that kind are really secondaries. They're not the primary problem. They stem from situations of grave injustice, situations that have been running on for year after year. Situations of injustice provide a seedbed for acts which become violent acts and which do great harm on innocent people. But it is as well to bear in mind that sometimes those who commit acts of terrorism, they themselves and their families have suffered grave injustice for years. Not for one moment do I condone acts of terrorism, nor for one moment do I believe that a political end is served by employing unjust methods to achieve it. But I begin to understand at that point, or I began to understand at that point, how it is that conflict occurs of the kind we have become so familiar with in recent years. When these hostages were safely back home, we were quickly thrown into another hostage situation in Libya. And I will not detail that tonight in any considerable way. I will move on to Beirut. But simply to say that British hostages were taken in Libya, and we again were approached by their relatives, and I set out for Libya and had face-to-face discussions with Colonel Gaddafi. He knew my size, as one amusing story. He knew that I was a tall person, and when I went to meet him, I noted that he'd put on his high-heel shoes, particularly too. He made sure, though, that I sat cross-legged at his feet while he sat way up on a podium. But nevertheless, we had interesting and useful discussions together, which resulted in the release of the people from Libya. Now, I mention this background because I want to come now more specifically and pointedly to Beirut. Because we had gained that form of reputation at Lambeth, it meant, of course, that we were receiving then requests from all over the place, many of which we had simply to say no to. We were approached in the first instance regarding the Lebanon by the Presbyterian Church of America, for whom I have a great respect. Fred Wilson from the Presbyterian Church came to Lambeth and asked us to try and work on behalf of Ben Weir, who was captured after working for many years in the Lebanon in very hard and difficult circumstances. He also asked if we would intervene on behalf of Martin Jenko, a Roman Catholic priest. We said no, because we were overextended, and because in my own assessment I had said that it seemed that the problem in the Lebanon was going to run on for years, that it was enormously complicated by politics, and that I was doubtful whether, without a very long-term commitment, it would be possible to move the situation. The representatives from the church went away, and sometime later they returned, and on the second time we said no. And on the third time when they came back, the situation had become increasingly serious. More hostages have been taken in the Lebanon. Terry Anderson, the correspondent from the Associated Press, John McCarthy from England, Brian Keenan from Ireland, and so on and so forth. A whole string of people had been captured, and at that point we said, well, yes, we will try. Knowing very well some of the difficulties. Again, access to the country this time was not difficult. There was no problem really with a visa. One could simply get on a plane in London and travel to Lebanon. But the same problem occurred as to how do you make contact. I'd had a message through contacts that the kidnappers would speak with me and wanted to speak with me, and that they would make contact with me via a shortwave radio. And so I established myself in the apartment of Terry Anderson, which was on the corniche overlooking the sea. And I stayed in his apartment, sitting by a shortwave radio, tuned into the right frequency, and I sat by that radio for day and night for quite some time. Eventually, as is often the case in these matters, the message didn't come via the radio. Simply, one evening, the telephone rang, and someone said, meet me in an hour's time at a certain address, which happened to be a doctor's surgery, a doctor's consulting room near to the American University of Beirut. I put the phone down and again had to consider the same old familiar ground. Is this genuine? Is it a trick? What will happen? I had bodyguards with me, but it's absolutely useless. The bodyguards were local people, but it's absolutely useless to take bodyguards with you for a meeting of that kind. It would simply be a provocative act. I decided again that this was a chance worth taking. And so I set out in a car with my bodyguards, who stopped 200 or 300 yards away from the house. They left me to walk the last few paces to the house. They went away, and I went in and met the doctor. He said to me, "I'm sorry, but you'll have to be blindfolded for the discussions." That's not too much of a hardship, but it presents a difficulty in negotiating. You can't see people's reactions, obviously. And if you depend a great deal on intuition in a negotiating process, it is a handicap. But, again, it's a handicap one had to accept. Several men, I was blindfolded, and several men came into the room. First of all, one had to determine what it was they wanted, and whether or not they were the people who actually did have access to the hostages. Immediately I said to them, "Will you take me to see the people you're holding?" They discussed amongst themselves and said, "No, we can't do that." Then I said, "I've brought this camera with me, this Polaroid camera. Will you take it and bring me pictures so that I can have some absolute proof that you are genuine, that you have access to them?" They said they would do that. There was a newspaper on the doctor's desk. I signed it, and I gave them the newspaper, and I said, "Please bring me back pictures as soon as you can, of each person holding this newspaper with my signature on it." They went away, and within a period of time returned with photographs of the American hostages. Those photographs have never appeared in public. I still have them in my possession. And it made me smile when I saw press reports at one stage after I was released saying Terry Waite was bluffing, he had no contact with the captors or the hostages at that point. No one knew, of course, that those pictures of the American hostages were and still are in my possession. We could then, when I had the photograph, looked after, and if in fact they had been unjustly detained, to pursue the matter, and certainly to convey messages from their families to these people. The captors readily accepted that. They went away again and brought me handwritten messages from the families, and I went away hoping that I would get support, political support, to get into Kuwait on humanitarian grounds. Thus began an extraordinarily difficult year of attempting to get access on humanitarian grounds only into that prison in Kuwait. Colonel Oliver North was the person designated by the American administration to be responsible on behalf of the administration for hostages. Just as there were others designated with that responsibility from other governments. France, the United Kingdom, different places. Anyone in a position such as myself, and I was the only person, so far as I know, to have had a face-to-face contact, albeit blindfolded, with the captors, it was quite natural that one should have contact with the various governments involved. Absolutely no mystery about it. In fact, the kidnappers knew that and expected me to have contact with the various administrations. They expected that, and if I had not have had that contact, I would have not had much credibility at all in their eyes. It's as simple and straightforward as that. But the critical and key question comes, were you, myself, as a church member, did you know about arms dealing? Were you implicated in that? And the simple and straightforward answer is a clear no. There is no way in which I ever would or could engage in that sort of business. I just do not believe it, or believe in it. If governments or political agencies wish to engage in that, that is their business. But it cannot be my business, and it cannot be the business of the church to do that. Why wasn't I told? I don't know clearly the answer to that, but I can surmise. The answer to it, of course, is that if I had been told, it was clearly known that I would have pulled away from the situation. And insofar as I was the only person to have face-to-face contact with the kidnappers, those from different governments would not wish me to pull away from the situation. As simple as that. No more mystery to it. They then said, Terry Anderson and Tom Sutherland are both very sick. And they're very depressed at the latest news. Because they are so sick and so depressed, and they may die, we'll give you an opportunity to come and see them. You asked a year ago, we said no, but now, because they're in such a bad condition, we'll let you come and see them. Again, faced with a dilemma. Is this a trick? Were they really sick? Was this a ploy? There's really no way of answering it. You just have to sit there and make a decision. I said, you'll keep me. If I come with you, you'll keep me. No, they said. All right. Give me your word as a Muslim that you won't. And the leader stretched out his hand and said, we will not keep you. I still wasn't convinced. I said, I'm not coming with you tonight. I'm going back to think about it. They agreed to that. I went back to my room and had a discussion with those people who were good advisors, local people, Muslims, friendly and able people. I said, what is the risk? I told them the story. They said, if he's given you his word as a Muslim, he shouldn't keep you. We don't think he will. All right, I said, I'll return. So the second night, I locked my cases, as I told you at the beginning of this small talk, went out and went back to the doctor's surgery. The doctor went out and left me alone. After 10 minutes or so, I heard the lift coming up. My contact met me. We went out together, down into the car, across Beirut, into an apartment where I was told to stay for a while. And then began the process that anyone will have to go through if you go to negotiate in these circumstances, which shows you how ridiculous some of the statements can be that are made about, for example, locator devices. One has to be totally stripped and searched. Every scar in the body is examined. Your teeth are examined. Your hair is examined to see if anything is being implanted in the body as a locator device. And if there is anything found, I can tell you, you wouldn't leave that building alive. And I certainly wouldn't be here today if anything had been found, or if I was carrying anything. When that process was over, we moved to another place and went around from building to building over a period of a few days, a procedure that I expected. Eventually, one night, we drove into a garage. A trapdoor was lifted in the floor, and I was asked to climb down. I did so with great apprehension, wondering if I was being ushered into the presence of other hostages who were sick, or whether this in fact was my capture. It was in fact my capture. I was put into a tiled cell. The door was closed, and I was left there sitting on the floor. No furniture, absolutely nothing. Tiled ceiling, walls, floor. Always an unpleasant sign, as it's an easy way to clean up, of course, if you're knocking somebody about. There were other people in adjacent cells. A whole complex had been built underground. And this is just one of the many underground prisons there are in the Middle East. Places where Lebanese hostages, and let us not forget them, have been kept, some of them for years, in a completely self-contained underground prison, deadly silent except for the small hum of a generator. And I sat on the floor and I said, that's it, I'm a hostage myself. And there were three things that I do remember that came to mind and which helped me survive in those years. No self-pity, no regrets, and no over-sentimentality. Self-pity seemed to me to be an absolute killer. Over-sentimentality is so easy to fall into, to think of the things one ought to have done for one's family or one's children and hadn't done. The times when one ought to have been a little more human, a little more understanding, a little more forgiving, a little more generous. And that can so often so lead into over-sentimentality that you begin to fall into despair and the spirit can die. I shall skip over the interrogations, the times of torture and misery. I'm trying to write about them at the moment. It is easier to write about them than to speak about them. And I hope that that writing will be published in America next year. But I skip over them for the moment. Why did they take me? I think because they made a calculation. They recognized that I had not got the political support to get into Kuwait, and they were impatient. And they felt also that they probably, insofar as I had a high profile, would have greater leverage if they held on to me rather than if they let me continue in my activities. That's part of the answer. There are other, more complex political arguments to be brought forward which can be derived from an understanding of the local politics of the situation, which again I shall explain in greater detail when I write about it. I have in fact, as a result of this experience, been enormously strengthened, even though the experience was black, dark and difficult, and extremely painful to bear. I come through it with a sense of compassion and feeling for those who suffer, which has been deepened. And I come through it with three simple sentences engraved on my heart. To somehow, in the years that are left to me in my life, to enable the weak and the powerless to be strong, to enable the strong to be just, and to enable the just, beyond everything, to be compassionate. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Terry Waite, thank you for sharing your story and your feelings with us as part of UniverCity 92. And thank all of you for joining us this evening. There are many more interesting programs yet to come in UniverCity 92 tomorrow and Friday, and we invite you to attend as many as you can. Again, thank you for being with us tonight.
Or you could always send it to them, but they forward it. Listen, but in that case, he'd be awfully pleased to hear from you. Because I should certainly tell him when I get back I've seen him. But yeah, do. Lovely to see you. Very nice to meet you. Fine. I hope you can hear all right, could you?
Nice to have you.
Good. All right, well, Bishop. Lovely to see you. Yeah, fine. We'll meet again. And next time I'm back, maybe we get longer together.
I hope so.
Okay, bye-bye.
So you're doing like us? Yeah. Yeah, I was one of the American girls there. That's right. I remember. Right.
I'm David's wife.
Very nice to meet you.
So glad you're back.
David Henry, I'm a Methodist minister at Geneva here in Indiana. I want you to know our congregation, the two of them I've served in the years you were held, kept you in our prayers weekly.
Well, I hope you'll pass on to them my thanks that I expressed publicly tonight. Those who didn't hear it, I'd be very grateful if you would.
And you don't look like you were an ostrich for very long.
Nice story.
That's a lovely story. It certainly is. It's nice to see you.
And you also, yeah. Hello. How are you? Oh, very nice to see you. Yeah, sure. How are you keeping? Very good. Yeah, left-handed. That makes you even a better person.
Thank you very much.
Nice to see you. How are you?
Appreciate what you
Very good. Love to meet you. Yeah.
I wanted to let you know you were still on our prayer list.
Oh, very nice to see you. Yeah.
Archbishop was just.
Oh, good. Oh, well. Love to see you. All the very best to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. How are you? Nice to see you. How are you? Are you here at the university? Oh, good. Oh, it's nice to see you. Yeah. Hello.
I just want to say that's one of the most moving things I've ever heard.
No,
Thank you for being here.
Love to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
I
Hello.
just want to say thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thanks for saying that. Nice to see you. Yeah. Hello, sir.
Our name is Hayes.
Hello.
We've been involved in spirituality for 10 years.
Ah, that's interesting.
Christ Church